Are we sitting comfortably? So the shape of the evening. So in this first half, we're going to have a conversation. We're going to have a conversation about one of Bante's talks. So it's been a while since I've had a conversation with Sanghadeva here. We've done it a few times in the past, but it seems like quite a long time ago. It's something that we both quite enjoy doing, actually. So I hope you enjoy listening to us or joining in. And then at the end of that, there'll be a chance for some questions. So we're not going to do formal discussion groups. We're going to have a sort of Q&A at the end of that. Then we'll have a cup of tea, and then we'll come back and have a meditation, and then we'll end traditionally with Jairatna leading us in the last Vandana. So that's the shape of the evening. So we're continuing our theme. Well, actually, before I do that, I think I'll introduce Sanghadeva, because some of you might not know Sanghadeva. Some of you will know Sanghadeva very, very well. He's a very good friend to the Shrewsbury Centre, to the Shrewsbury situation. In fact, when I came here back in 2003 or 4, I think, and I walked into the Quaker meeting house, I think the first person that met me was Sanghadeva. And he would come up every week from Birmingham with a van load of mats and cushions and would lead the class. And he did that for many years. So he's been a real friend. He's a real believer in outreach, in getting out. So 4 different groups went out from Birmingham to set up 4 different centres. And he was very much, he was behind 2 of those. So that's one string to his bow. He's also, at the moment, he lives at Adhisthana, which is down in Ledbury, which is kind of like the main hub of Triratna, if you like, certainly in the UK. And he's their gardener. Although, funnily enough, he said to me the other day, he's not that into gardening. He just likes hard work, and he likes the inspiration of creativity. So I don't know, he's getting on a bit now, but I can't keep up with him. If you try, and I know many young men and women at Adhisthana can't work for a day with Sanghadeva, they can't keep up with his energy. So he's got a lot of energy, and he throws that into whatever he does. He used to run a restaurant, Hockney's, below the Croydon Buddhist Centre years ago. He was ordained in 83.
Yeah, 1983.
By Sangharakshita in Il Convento in Italy. So most of his, pretty much all his adult life, he has been involved with and very committed to Triratna. And he's a dear friend of mine. He's my preceptor. So he ordained me back in 2015 and gave me the name Abhayanara. And it's always a delight to be in his presence. I feel a real sense of friendship, both on a kind of equal horizontal level, but also on a vertical level. Someone I can really look up to and go to with all sorts of things. We can kind of chew the fat over the kitchen table, or we can get into some real nitty-gritty about all sorts of issues. So he's just been a really, really good friend to me, and I think a really good friend to this situation. So it's always a delight to have him here. And Sanghadeva is not a particularly, I don't think of him as a big public figure in the movement, but he's slowly becoming more public. He's become president of the Croydon Centre. And actually, when he says things, most people take note. He's a kind of quiet force at work that often really can put his finger on things and say some very, very wise things indeed. No pressure.
No pressure.
So the talk we're going to look at, well, it's in the theme. So as you know, in this series over the autumn, winter, we're continuing looking at the themes of the Centre's vision. So those 4 themes. So there's awakening, community, altruism, and passing on are the 4 kind of vision, the main themes of the Centre. And this talk we've chosen comes under the altruism theme, under the kind of helping people express their altruistic dimension of Dharma practice. And it made me think of Sanghadeva because he's a great believer in passing on. He's a great believer in getting out there and sharing what we've been given. So that's why I went for that. But I think looking at this talk, it's as much about community as well, creating a community based on metta and spiritual friendship. So it speaks to that as well. So the talk is Evolution or Extinction, Current World Problems, a Buddhist View. So a little topic, not a very weighty topic. I think I was quite attracted by the topic. I thought it was like, what's Bante got to say about current world problems? I remember this talk was given back in 1971, so it's a few years old. And in it, Well, he outlines the historical background of current world problems, and he goes into quite a lot of detail, which I don't think we were saying earlier. We probably need a whole or several weeks to really do this talk justice. There's a lot in it, so we're just going to kind of cherry pick. But he says that the current world problems, in fact, not just current, but throughout history, world problems have been essentially problems between groups. So he really looks at what he calls the group, he looks at what he calls the individual, and he looks at what he calls the spiritual community. So those are the main kind of, that you might be familiar with, but those are the main thing he picks up on. And he said that these problems can only really be solved by people withdrawing support from the group or influencing them more positively from an experience of being in a spiritual community. So that's the kind of very short, pithy précis of the whole talk. And yeah, it's quite hard to know where to begin, but I think what we're going to do is we're going to unpack a little bit these terms, this group, the spiritual community, the individual. But before I go any further, I'm just going to ask Sanghadeva just to say, what did you make of the talk? What were your impressions? How did you?
Well, for a start, Bhante Sangharakshita, he said that he was asked to give this talk. He didn't volunteer this talk because he doesn't normally give a talk on world problems. He's normally interested in Buddhist doctrine like Noble Eightfold Path, the White Lotus Sutra, Vimalakirti Nadesha, etc., etc. So he'd never really, I mean, obviously he thinks about world problems, but he'd never really been motivated to give a talk. So it was only because he was requested that he actually gave this talk, which I think is quite interesting. I think the main thing I sort of realised from this talk, and this is something that Bhante always does, he takes a particular, so let's call it problem, and he puts it in a cosmic perspective. I only can describe it as a cosmic perspective. Yeah, I think we all know, we all realise that we all have problems, but one of the problems with our problems is that they are very, very subjective and tiny in a sense. It's not that they're not important, but in the bigger picture of things, they fit in, they make sense only in a bigger picture of things. And what he does in this lecture is he takes world problems and he sort of puts them almost in a cosmic sort of perspective. And he deals with it from that point of view. And I think partly the reason for that is that we so easily over-focus on our problems, and we sort of can retreat into our own world. We just have this horrified anxiety, and we just retreat into our own space, and we don't really know what to do. We either don't know what to do, or we think, oh, Buddhism's going to solve everything. We either go from, the complete retreat to a complete naive belief that Buddhism is the solution to all the world's problems. So this is what he's sort of saying. He said, well, it's not quite like that. And it's certainly quite not as easy as just if everyone was Buddhist, all the problems would go away. It certainly isn't like that. So I think to summarize that, it's that Bhante always takes a problem, as it were, and puts it in a much, much bigger context. So you can start looking at it from a much bigger, in a sense, much higher perspective. So that was what I took from this lecture.
It's interesting that point you said about that horrified anxiety.
Yeah. Because
he sets out these world problems, and this is in 1971, and they're just as relevant today. So he sees them as kind of conflict. He sees them as mental and psychological problems, social problems, economic problems, all the problems he lists. You just think, they're just as relevant today. And he's saying they're not new problems. They're old problems. But in a sense, the problem that we've got is they're ramped up. They're more global today. And this is back in 1971. Because of the way the world is, the world shrank effectively. So these problems have become kind of enlarged because of the world shrinking. And he said, often, how do we respond when we come up against these problems? And we might respond emotionally. We might respond with kind of indignation, with outrage, with anger, with frustration, with anxiety. But he said, interestingly, after that dies down, that initial response, that initial emotion, we're often left feeling helpless. And I really related with that. And he said, out of that helplessness, we then retreat back into our lives. and we sort of pretend it's not happening, or we just go about our life thinking, what can we do? These problems are so huge. The world, I'm so small. What can I do? So we just retreat. And I thought that was really interesting. And he makes a challenge, doesn't he?
He does.
He says,
very, very strong challenge.
this retreating from the problem, he says, is an abdication of our responsibility as a human being. This retreating from the problem is an abdication of our responsibility as a human being. And that really struck me. I don't know if it struck you.
Very much so.
And it's like, we've got to take responsibility, not just for ourselves, but for the whole world, in a sense, for these problems, you know. So then he says, so what is one going to do? Well, this is where he goes global, or even more so, he puts the whole thing in a huge perspective by going back to the dawn of time. So he retraces the dawn of time and the history of humankind, which is quite remarkable. And he divides it into various eras. He calls it, I mean, then he used the word man. Today we'd use the word human, but back in 71, they weren't quite as on it in terms of their terms. So he has primitive man, true man, and then he has the modern period. So I won't go into all that. You can listen to the talk. But what's interesting is he picks out this axial age, doesn't he? This transition point between true man, which was like sort of 30,000 years of history before modern period, which was the last 2,500 years. And he said there's a period between those two of 600 years, which he calls the axial period, which isn't his term. It's something he's picked up on from other people. And it's this time was a time bursting with creative and spiritual energy. And it's the time where there are a lot of great thinkers, philosophers, artists, you name it, across the world. And he cites a few of these, and it made me think of dear old Sanghadeva because he's a bit of an ancient Greek fan, and he loves Socrates and Plato. And you started telling me over dinner, actually, there's all these other, in that period of ancient Greece, that civilization, all these amazing thinkers, artists, philosophers. But then he goes to Israel. You've got the great prophets of Israel, like Jeremiah, Isaiah. You go to China, you've got the great thinkers and philosophers, Lao Tzu and Confucius. You can go to India, and of course you've got the Buddha, and you've got Mahavira, who founded Jainism. So in this period of 600 years, there's all these figures that he says it was a key time in human history. It was an axial age, and it fundamentally shifted human history. And I found that riveting. Yeah. And he said, why? And he said, because these people stand out as recognizable. They are, because of their individuality. And this is where he gets into this term individuality. And he really, a lot of the talk is about this idea of being a true or a real individual. And so, well, I think we'll just listen to what he says about what that means, being a real or a true individual as he sees these figures. So if Vajrapriya could just...
Other people. But an individual is something different, not an individualist. An individual, a real individual, a true individual, whether a religious, a spiritual individual, or a creative individual, or thinking individual, a real individual is one who has developed in one way or another, through one discipline or another, to one degree or another, greater or less, self-awareness and self-consciousness. In other words, an individual is one who is not just a member of a group, who transcends the group, not just a member of the tribe, the nation, the state, not a member and just a member of any sort of group at all. He stands, as it were, on his own 2 feet. He's just an individual, alone, if you like, unique. He's one who has, we may say, a direct, personal relationship with the deeper reality of things. His relationship is not just, as it were, on the surface. In fact, we can go so far as to say, perhaps, in a somewhat poetic way, perhaps, that an individual is one through whom, as it were, the deeper reality of things, the truth behind appearances, if you like, functions in the world, or is present in the world. Through the individual, the true individual, you see the universal. The individual and the universal, in fact, coincide.
Great, thanks. So, what do you make of that, Sanghadeva?
Well, I think for me, this was that I'm personal, but personally speaking, I think this is the greatest revelation of coming across Buddhism, was this idea of that we were only going to change the world as individuals. And the paradox is that individuals only arise in certain contexts. So there is a sort of apparent contradiction between having a spiritual community, which is a sort of collective, and then out of the spiritual community, individuals arise. Because what that seems to suggest is that our work, if you like, in order to help create the arising of individuals, for us, and I've always felt this for me, is to try and create environments and conditions through which and in which individuals can arise. And for me, that's what I want. That's what I want to do. That's what I want to do. I want to help create conditions through which and in which individuals can arise, because individuals only arise to the extent that they have supportive conditions. So that's what we're doing. This is what I feel we're doing with True Ratna Community. We're creating conditions in which true individuals will arise, will arise.
Because he says that's the purpose of a spiritual community, is to create the conditions for true or real individuals to arise, and also enable those individuals to communicate. Yeah. Because he said what's important is that those people communicate at a very real and a very deep level. He's called the Triratna Buddhist order a free association of individuals, hasn't he? So I'm interested to know, what's your experience of the order as being a free association of individuals? Do you think it's been a successful project, or do you think it's ongoing?
I think it's a proto-project. I mean, it's very difficult to be an individual, but I do feel, I mean, when I look at how many people I've known for 30, 40 years who are still practicing, who I still feel we are practicing ethics, are still trying to move their practice forward. You know, they turn up week after week, year after year. There must be something going on, because no one's getting paid. You know, I mean, no one's becoming famous. I mean, do you know what I mean? It's like, what are we actually getting out of this? We wouldn't do it unless something was arising amongst us. But of course, it's not always easy to know. And it's quite subtle and mysterious. But I certainly feel, my experience is overall that I feel very excited by the project that we're involved with, just generally. I mean, not just Sri Sri Sangha, but the creating of these conditions through which individuals can arise. And I do feel we're making progress. I definitely feel we're making progress. And I think there's some very, very impressive people around.
I'd be interested to know, on a kind of personal level, what's your journey been like to becoming a truer individual? If that terminology works for you, it kind of makes me think, I suppose, of integrity, of someone who's prepared to stand on their own 2 feet, not go along with the group for the sake of it. It's really follow their values and their beliefs. Yeah,
it's not easy. I think it's quite a difficult thing to do, because internally you have so much conditioning. I mean, I'm very aware in myself how I conform and how I don't speak out, or how I don't challenge things when I ought to, or when I don't stand up and say what I think and feel about things. So, because you want to be liked. I mean, this is the thing, the great tragedy of the human situation. One of them is that we want to be liked by everybody. But one of the characteristics of a true individual is they don't mind being disagreed with. I mean, how many of us could say we actually even enjoy the challenge of being disagreed with? Most of us don't. So I think you can tell whether you're a true individual or not by what happens when someone disagrees with you. I think I've got some way to go in that, but I'm still at the coalface. So I think that if I look back and think, well, I'm still having a go, that's all you can do. I mean, all you can do is just keep turning up and keep trying. I mean, hopefully your spiritual friends who are a little bit further on the path can help maybe sometimes remind you, think, yeah, you could do this, or, you know, you're really great. Why don't you trust that more in yourself, or something like that? So we help each other. So my experience has been just steady work. It's not always been easy. It's not always, it's been very obvious and very clear. I've had extended periods where I've doubted myself.
And have you found in those times being amongst a community,
yes,
a spiritual community,
yes,
you know, Kalyana Mitrata,
yes,
spiritual friendships,
yeah,
is invaluable.
It's essential. This is absolutely essential. I think I can't come to it quickly, but there's something in here where he talks about the true individuals of what exists between them. Is this sort of spark of something beyond either of you? It's this is probably a bit of a contentious term, but I don't mean it in any sexual way, like what I would describe as eros. This idea that when you meet a true individual or a spiritual friend, when you meet them and you communicate with them, something passes between you that is not to do with either of you personally. It's as if you, in collective association, you bring about some higher consciousness, and this is what he's talking about. Because I think individuality is a sort of channeling. He doesn't say it. What does he say? It's in and through the individual. What's the term there? You've got it there.
He says, through the individual, the true individual, you see the universal.
Yeah, that's right.
The individual and the universal, in fact, coincide.
Okay, so I think the only way the universal emerges is in communication with other people who are more individual than you are, as it were. It's a mysterious alchemical process. I mean, in a way, the Dharma is the Sangha. The Sangha is the Dharma. Communication is everything. It might be a little bit difficult concept to get a head around, but if you've had really deep, satisfying communication with someone else in the spiritual community, or anybody actually, you go away thinking that something special has just happened between us. And it's not of this world. That's the other thing. Do you know what I mean? It's not a romantic thing. It's not about looking at someone's eyes and go, oh, I really love you. I've finally met my sort of soulmate. It might feel like that in a certain way, but there's another element, this element of the universal that sort of appears amongst true individuals, or not even true individuals. I think, you know, friendship at an ordinary level, you experience this. So I think for me, that has been my overwhelming experience. Has been, I have had many occasions on which I have experienced this extremely magical atmosphere that seems to exist between people that are committed to the spiritual life.
When you were, say, communicating with Bhante, for example, did you get a sense of a true individual, or did you get a sense of that type of communication, or was it not? Was it different?
It was a bit different because it was very easy to be distracted by him as a sort of physical human being and with all his habits and personality, which I know it's not to everybody's taste, but on another level, I knew that as soon as I heard a lecture, it's funny, we're listening to his voice now. I can remember sitting around in a room, Aryatara, many, many years ago. That's the first ever Buddhist community in Triratna community in Purley. I can remember the first time I ever heard Bhante speaking, I thought, this is my teacher. I had no idea what that meant, but I just knew that this guy was my teacher. How did I know that? I don't know how I knew that. I'm not really particularly susceptible to worshipping people or getting, you know, I've never, when I look back at my life when I was young, I've never done that with people, pop stars, you know, footballers and all. I've never, ever done that with people. But there was something about his voice. He talked the truth and it changed my life. So he's changed my life, basically.
I mean, I think for me around this area, it's something about being really listened to.
Yes.
On the one level, and there's something about communicating at a deeper level that isn't you.
Yes.
Because, you know, you can do the you bit. You can do all the kind of peripheral, shallow stuff, should we call it, which I think has got its place.
Yes.
But then there's something about really meeting someone that is more than them and more than you.
Very much so.
And I think that's what this territory speaks of to me. But it's very hard to put your finger on it. And it's quite hard to communicate it as well without other people thinking you're a bit bonkers.
Bit woo-woo.
Yeah. Well, I get that with you, for example.
Yeah, we do,
can
don't we?
communicate on different
Yeah.
levels. We
Yeah.
can have a bit of a laugh.
Yeah.
Or we can sometimes just we can be chopping the potatoes and go straight in at a kind of boomf.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's not you and it's not me,
No,
but it
that's
is.
true.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that's what this kind of speaks of
Yes.
to me.
Yes.
And I mean, it's odd, isn't it? The trouble is, when you talk about the true individual, so what's not a true, it all can get a bit black and white, can't it? And it's, you know, but then you can over nuance it as well.
Yeah.
Because there's something about, well, Bante talks about, what I hear him saying is you cannot deal with the worldly problems on the level of the group.
That's right.
And that's what we're trying to do.
Exactly.
It's on a different level,
Exactly.
isn't it?
I think this is really what he's trying to get at in this lecture. Ultimately, there are no solutions to the problems of the world on the level at which they present themselves to us. And he's saying that the only way of dealing with the problems as they present themselves to us in the world is for us to create true individuals and a spiritual community. Because this is samsara. This is the veil of unreality, if you like. And what a true individual does is able to show that this is a veil, it's Maya, it's Maya's dance, it's an illusion, as it were, relatively speaking, and that there is a more beautiful world through this one, beyond this one. And that's what a true individual and a spiritual community ultimately are trying to show people. In fact, actually, I would say as a spiritual community, that's what we are showing the world. We might not know we're doing that, but that's what we show the world. People come in and go, what is it with you people? There's something going on. He says, yeah. Well, you look at each other and say, is it you? Is it me? No, who is it? It's something that we create together. Because there are more or less individuals there, as it were.
But I think there are individuals, but then there's this really importance of communication, isn't there?
Yeah.
It's people meeting each other in their depths.
Yes.
So that's the essence, in a way, of what we call Kalyana Mitrata, isn't it?
Beautiful friendship.
Beautiful friendship, where you're really meeting someone, you're really seeing someone, regardless of what they're like, what their background is, what they look like, what they're
you might not even like their character.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Might wind you up something crazy.
Well, it's funny, a friend of mine went recently, I mean, I hope I'm not speaking out totally, but a friend of mine.
We might have to censor Sangharakshita sometimes. So.
went to see Subhuti, and he said, oh, I don't think I really like Bante, but he's profoundly inspired by him. So do you see what I'm saying? Do you see the paradox? It's not about liking. That's not what we prioritize in the spiritual community. It's about this deep, profound connection that we have with one another on a completely not personal level.
And it's interesting in this talk. So he really he has a bit of a go at the group. He kind of bigs up the spiritual community, and he bigs up the true individual, doesn't he? And he's kind of saying the answer lies, as we're saying, not on the level of the group, but on the level of the spiritual community and the true individual. So let's just have a little listen to another quote, which is the let's have a look. Yeah. So this is where he's seeing. He makes it very simple. Actually, he defines his terms. He gives the whole history of mankind, and then he says, "But there's only one solution to all these current world problems. And what is that solution?" So, cue Vajrapriya.
So, in this sort of situation, what is the solution? Personally, I see only one solution. And it's a comparatively long-term solution, so let's hope we have enough time to put it into effect. The solution, the only solution really, is that that is to say the human race, has to produce more individuals, more true individuals, and more spiritual groups. And these, the true individuals and the spiritual communities, will act as they've always acted, but now we hope more powerfully and effectively than ever, act as a leaven. And eventually, to some extent at least to the extent, that marginal extent of safety, transform the whole group, the whole global group. So we can say that a consideration of current world problems makes it clear to us that we have before us today only two alternatives. On the one hand, there's what we call evolution, the higher evolution, spiritual development, becoming an individual. That's one alternative, and the other alternative is extinction. It really means that we, the human race, that is to say, individual members of the human race, must develop spiritually, or sooner or later just perish.
Thank you. So quite strong stuff, really.
Evolve or die.
Evolve or die. Evolve or go extinct.
Go extinct. Yeah.
And that's even more poignant with the extinction we're faced with at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's interesting, in the talk, he referenced the ecological crisis, but he said that's a kind of new word. You know, that's only just coming into being, as it were. Whereas obviously now it would probably be top of the list, wouldn't it? The kind of, and this whole idea of extinction, you know, you've got Extinction Rebellion, haven't you?
Yeah.
So this evolve or go extinct. So this evolve spiritually is quite, and he introduces this term, the higher evolution, that he's used. I don't know if you've got anything to say about that.
Well, I think one way of looking at that is that a lot of what we deal with in meditation is the tendencies of the lower mind, as you could say, the tendencies to prioritize self over other. And I'm sure that's got really, really important evolutionary reasons why we do that. Protecting self, protecting family, protecting the group. These are really necessary functions of evolution. But the problem is that when you try to, as it were, jettison the self, that's maybe not a very good self, or you try to see through the self or suspend the self, or try to suspend your will and behave more with metta, these lower energies or lower forces are constantly imposing themselves on our conscious mind. And what we have to try and do if we want to try and evolve spiritually is we have to realize that we need to move beyond those primal functions of fight or flight, or it's either me or you. Do you know what I mean? These very sort of basic sort of feelings you have, you know. So we need to basically be turning down the volume on those, and as it were, allowing those more expanded, metaphor, expansive states of consciousness to become the predominant current that is directing our being, as it were, and that the lower sort of functions, that we don't allow those to dominate our mind, if you like. So that's the job. And slowly, we find that we can replace those sort of more basic, more sort of self-orientated volitions with much more expansive, beautiful, inclusive mental states, where ultimately we see that we are all one, as it were. And that's not a numerical one, by the way, that's a sort of philosophical one, which is slightly different. Where actually, ultimately, we realize, as the Buddha did, that actually the appearance of us all being separate individuals is illusory, that on the deepest level of mind, there is simply mind, as it were, through which we all participate and through which we can be sort of one with other, as it were. And this is all poetry, by the way. It's not philosophy, it's poetry. So that's fundamentally, I think, what he's getting at.
It's interesting you talked
these
about
two tendencies
in meditation, but I also say you could say in communication, in working together, in just being within a sangha.
Certainly.
In a way, that's how you are trying to be. Isn't it? You're trying to be on that level of less what's in it for me.
Yeah, what's in it for me.
Yeah.
You know, so it's more as a phrase that Sangharakshita uses, moving from the power mode to the love mode. This is a sort of little phrase he came up with, that most of our way of relating to the world and to other people is through power. Is how can we best promote our own needs, rather than how can I augment the being of another person. And that's not a normal sort of way of doing things, isn't it? Where you see all your relationships is How can I help this person flourish?
Mm.
How can I help create conditions in which beings can flourish, where you're prepared to put your own needs, not away, but certainly to one side, as it were, where you start even prioritizing the being of another over yourself, as it were.
But in a way that fulfills your own needs as well.
Well,
doesn't it?
that's the paradox.
Yeah,
That's the
yeah,
paradox.
the two start to dissolve.
Yeah,
don't
you're
they?
absolutely right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And have you noticed that in your journey, in your kind of spiritual life, how at first it might have been what you can get out of it?
It's still
and what you want?
work. It's still work. I noticed only the other day, like I live with someone like Yashadeva he's much sort of more kind, and, he always volunteers to give people's lifts from the station. And I'm still a bit like, well, why don't they walk? They've got legs and they can't use them. You know what I mean? I'm not saying that he's right and I'm wrong, but do you know what I mean? With that attitude where you're always looking for an opportunity to sort of be helpful. It's a difficult thing to do. It is difficult, but you can learn to do it. It's like a muscle. You can practice it. You can do it. You can learn to volunteer to do this, or make the tea, or put an extra £10 note in the dana bowl, or whatever it is you can think of. And then it becomes habitual, and then you realize, yes, it's beautiful. It's like, wow, actually, I feel a lot more free and open. And that is the higher relief. You feel like that's the evolving of consciousness that's coming through. So it's not easy. It is a struggle. And I think we all need to be making a resolution to notice when we're doing me, mine, and I, and when we could all do a little bit more of like, what do you need? What is needed out there? It's work. It's just work. You
can see it physically, can't you?
I mean,
when you do the me, myself, you go like this.
That's right.
And then when you're sort of doing things for yourself,
it's right. That's what it feels.
It's expansive, isn't it?
It does.
Yeah. So we can get all kind of lofty in these terms of higher evolution and transcendental this and that, but it can come down to quite ordinary things.
I think it's very, very ordinary. It's not the great sort of altruistic gesture. Very often it's simply asking someone how is making the tea, asking someone how if they want shopping done, etc., etc. The beauty is that your energy levels just simply increase. It's as if your energy doesn't come from your will anymore. It's as if you're channeling some energy that comes from the ultimate, as it were, at least on a much reduced level. And so paradoxically, you don't get tired, you get more energy. I remember Bhante really criticizing this thing that when Bob Geldof did this thing called compassion fatigue. Do you remember? He came up with this thing. I mean, he was doing really good work. He wasn't crying that. But Bhante said, compassion knows no fatigue. It's really interesting, isn't it? Compassion knows no fatigue. Because the energy that drives it, or the mind that drives it, is not the mundane mind. So that's an interesting, he was being somewhat provocative perhaps, but I think he was making a very, very interesting point.
I mean, he says in this about on the journey to becoming a true individual, how there's an unblocking of energy.
Yeah.
And that you do experience people, don't you, who seem to have sort of boundless energy. Yeah. Well, I see it in you a bit actually, but someone like, I don't know, there's people, Subhuti is the classic, isn't it? Yeah. So he's quite a senior figure in the movement. He's what, in his 70s now?
73.
And he's tireless.
Yeah, absolutely tireless.
Yeah.
And that's one thing we'll all find as we become more individual, we will have more energy, more joy.
There's interest, and there's something about it, it makes me think a little bit of ethics.
Yeah.
And when you've got something that it's not quite right, it's kind of bugging you.
Yeah.
So it gets in there and it blocks, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And you're just like, there's something, it could be quite major, it could be quite something minor, unskillful you've done. And then you do something about it and something's released, isn't it? And you're just like, And I think those things that I've noticed as I practice, they become more and more subtle. And you notice just that little word you said to someone that you just think, actually, that wasn't very good. And it sticks, doesn't it? And then it blocks.
It does.
And I guess that's what this kind of energy blocking.
That's right.
And the more you let release, I'm going like this again.
That's right.
The more you kind of like open and you just become more energized, don't you? And then this idea that it's not you. There's like something working. Well, I mean, I'm getting a bit wary of talking because Bhante uses the term suprapersonal, doesn't it? The suprapersonal force. And it could easily become kind of thing, can't it? Or some kind of God or some kind of, Star Wars, the Force. But there is something about just going beyond one's own self needs and wants, and
And really, this is what this lecture is about. It's about trying to set up conditions whereby more and more of us can do that. And what a force of good we can be in the world. Not everyone's going to be a Buddhist, but if there are enough people who are individuals who are in free association with each other, we can achieve a disproportionate amount of good in the world. Because that's, if you look back to the Axial Age, that's exactly what happened in the Axial Age. I think many of the ideas and values that were developed during the Axial Age we're still living by. Much of our language comes from that period, as it were. Much of our philosophical and scientific language and way of thinking about logic and ethics comes from that age. And of course, Christianity is sort of rode on the back of it for millennia. And that's what we can do as aspiring individuals. We can help create, if you like, an Axial Age. We could do that.
Well, he references that, a fifth age, doesn't he? Yeah. So he says in response to this, evolve or die, if you like, evolve or go extinct.
Yes.
He's very keen on we take responsibility.
Yes.
And he even says, do 4 things. He's quite good like this, Fantes, and he always gives you, he makes it very clear. You'll do 4 things, or there's 3 things, or there's this. So he gives you 4 things. And one of those is develop yourself, is it? And he talks there about developing one's consciousness, which you talked a little bit about when you talked about meditation.
Yeah.
And so a regular meditation practice. So the importance of meditation to simplify one's life, for example. He gives a whole kind of list of ways you can do this. Not to waste time on unnecessary activities. Well, hey, that's a biggie, isn't it? Click, click. Base one's life more on ethical principles. Refinement of one's emotions through experience of the finite. So it's all stuff we're kind of familiar with, isn't it? And it's like the distinctive emphases, if you like, that he talks about. So that's one thing, is to develop ourselves, I guess, on this path to true individuality. The other one is joining a spiritual community. So it's being in regular and real communication with other individuals. So this kind of, and he wants it to be a real spiritual exchange, a spiritual workshop, if you like. Yeah. And I think I
like this term, a spiritual exchange.
Yeah.
That's really lovely, isn't it? Because that means that we're all learning from each other. I think that's so important, and I think that's one of. I mean, this is a bit of a sort of. I think why our movement is so. I think it's unique, actually, in a way, in as much that we don't have like teachers and disciples, for instance. We have people who go for refuge at different levels at different times in their lives, and together we share our experience. I mean, there's some people who will be more experienced and some who will be less experienced, but we don't set it up as a sort of hierarchy which has got a very, very fixed way of communicating. So it's an exchange. Where was it? Yeah, it's a spiritual exchange. I love that term. It's really, really excellent.
And this non-hierarchical is really interesting, isn't it?
No.
Because there's definitely a sense of respect, and a sense of, like we talked about, vertical and horizontal friendship, didn't we? Yeah. And that's not like hierarchy in the same, in how we think of a hierarchy, is it? It's more just like, it's a bit like respecting your elders, isn't it?
It's openness. It's openness to the being of another person. When you're open, no one needs to say they're more developed or less developed. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if someone's more developed or less developed. There's just openness. And in openness, mutual openness, there can be learning, as it were, and sharing.
And it runs both ways. So he's saying to develop ourselves, join a spiritual community, withdraw, this is quite a term, withdraw support from all anti-spiritual forces, i.e. all groups that weaken the ideal of individuality. So he said this may include the family, the church, the state. And this is 1971, so there's probably a few more we could add now, isn't it? That's quite pokey.
It's very pokey.
Yeah, that might not go down well in some circles.
No, it might not well.
But there we go.
Anyway, there you go. Discuss.
Yes. And then the last one, exert any influence for good that you can in any group. So he said it's unavoidable to be in certain groups. We're all, just through our conditioning, we're in groups, we're in families, we're in tribes, we're in this, we're in that, and that's fine. But speak up for the area of individuality. So try and influence people in the area of individuality and never allow yourself just to go along with the group.
Definitely.
And that takes courage.
It does. And I've seen a lot of people make huge progress in this area, in the area of work, for instance, you know, especially with things like gossip in the workplace, where people, you get drawn into talking and about somebody who's not, someone goes out the door and you all start going, well, you know what? I think they're, and you just go, do you know what? I don't think that's good. I don't think that's right. I don't think that's honest. Especially, you know, in certain sort of clubs where people get together and just take the piss out of each other and all the rest of it, to use that term.
Steady.
Sorry.
And you know, don't you?
You do know.
And as you practice, you know these things stick, don't they?
They do.
You know when you feel you've not acted your best.
You do.
And your friends can point that out
in
the best will in the world.
That's right.
But also you know yourself, don't you?
So don't go along with the group, you know, and it's not easy.
So we've got flashing lights.
It's great.
Come for you.
It's brilliant. Come on, bring it on.
So in the concluding part, he said if sufficient people do these four things, so develop themselves, join spiritual communities, withdraw support from the groups, the unhelpful groups, and exert any influence for good, to sort of big up individuality, then we'd have more and more individuals produced and a sort of network of spiritual communities all over the world, exerting a sort of silent, unseen influence. Because I think he's clear they're always going to be small. They're always going to be small numbers compared with groups. Groups are getting bigger. And he said it started off with like the family network, then it went to the tribe, then it went to the nation state, now it's gone to the corporation. They're just getting massive. And that's why our problems are getting massive in a way. But this kind of a silent, unseen influence. And then he says each individual will become like an earthworm. The idea we all become like earthworms, which we were talking about with Karen earlier. So I'm just going to leave you with the last quote, which picks up on this earthworm. And this is how he ends the talk.
So if a sufficiently large number of people, of individuals, are, as it were, earthworms, you know, burrowing, tunneling, withdrawing their support, loosening the soil, then these, not only these structures, these groups, but the current world problems associated with them will sort of, we may say, collapse. The center of gravity will shift. The center of gravity in world affairs will shift if this sort of thing happens. It will shift from the conflicting group or groups to the cooperating, indirectly or directly cooperating, spiritual communities. And when that achieves, when, as it were, the influence of the spiritual communities, of the individuals, outweighs the influence of the groups as such, then humanity as a whole, practically, will have passed into a higher, a new stage of evolution, of human history, into what we might even describe as a fifth period of human history. And all this is possible. All this can be achieved. But it's a very big and a rather terrible but. We may not have very much time left. So it becomes the duty in this sort of situation of every thinking human being to take very serious stock of his or her own position. It becomes everybody's duty to give very serious consideration to the view which at least one Buddhist takes of current world problems.
There we go. Job done. So that's how he ends it. It's interesting. It made me think when I heard that. There's someone that we both know called Saraha. He was Bante's carer for many years, and he paraphrases Bante's advice. And I don't know if it was thinking about this talk, but he says, "Be an individual, think for yourself, follow your inspiration, stay in communication." And I thought that was a really lovely little pithy phrase that when I heard this talk, it just thought, oh, that's what he said there. So be an individual, think for yourself, follow your inspiration, stay in communication. Should we leave it there?
Yeah.